A dying Special Forces sniper landed by Black Hawk, and the only person the military asked for was not the famous trauma surgeon standing in the middle of the ER. It was the new nurse with the limp. Have you ever been judged by the one thing people could see, while the truth you carried stayed buried where no one bothered to look? That night in San Antonio, the civilian trauma floor was already breaking under sirens' blood and exhausted hands. Then the windows began to shake. Rotor thunder rolled over the hospital. Medics rushed in with a man bleeding through combat dressings, and a major shouted one name that froze the room. Harbor 6. Stay with this story because it is not just about saving a soldier. It is about pride, hidden scars, and the moment quiet strength takes command. Like this video and comment where you're watching from. Before the name Harbor 6 froze the emergency room, before the rotors shook dust from the ceiling, before a dying sniper opened his eyes to a voice from his past. Grace Callahan was just the new nurse with the limp. That was how Lone Star Regional Trauma Center first learned her. Not by her hands, not by her eyes, not by the stillness she carried into loud rooms, by the hitch in her right leg. She arrived in San Antonio on a Monday morning in late August, when the heat had already climbed off the pavement and settled against the hospital windows like a living thing. The city outside was moving hard before breakfast. Pickup trucks rattled over patched roads. Ambulances cut through traffic with their sirens bouncing off overpasses. Somewhere north, a military helicopter crossed the pale sky toward Camp Bullis, its sound low and familiar enough that nobody on the sidewalk looked up. Grace did, only for half a second. Then she adjusted the strap of her faded canvas duffel and stepped through the automatic doors of Lone Star Regional. The emergency department smelled like every emergency department she had ever known, and none of them. Antiseptic, burned coffee, warm plastic, sweat trapped under scrubs. The faint copper trace of blood that lived under everything, no matter how often the floors were cleaned. Fluorescent lights flattened every face into the same tired color. Monitors beeped in uneven rhythms. A printer jammed near the nurse's station, clicking like an insect trapped under glass. A man in a construction vest sat in triage with a towel wrapped around his hand. A young mother bounced a feverish toddler against her hip while whispering prayers into the child's hair. 2 police officers stood beside a patient handcuffed to a bed, their faces blank with the practiced boredom of men trying not to feel the room. Grace paused just inside the doors. She did not look lost. That was the first thing charge nurse Marcy Reed noticed. Most new hires entered the trauma floor with one of 2 faces. Some looked hungry, eager to prove they belonged. Others looked overwhelmed, eyes jumping from alarm to stretcher to blood pressure cuff as if the department itself had teeth. Grace Callahan did neither. She took in the room once, slowly like a person reading weather. Then she walked toward the nurse's station. The limp showed more clearly across the long stretch of polished tile. It was not severe. It did not drag behind her. It was just enough to interrupt the rhythm of her stride, a subtle favoring of the right leg when her weight shifted. Polite people pretended not to notice it. Emergency medicine had very few polite people. Marcy noticed it immediately. She was standing behind the station with a clipboard tucked under one arm, a phone against her ear, and a pen held between her teeth. Her hair was pulled into a smooth knot that looked too precise for a room that constantly tried to ruin precision. She had the kind of posture that made people straighten before she said a word. Grace stopped at the counter. Marcy ended her call, pulled the pen from her mouth, and glanced at the personnel folder in front of her. Grace Callahan. Yes. Transfer from Montana. Yes. Critical care certification. Trauma experience. Prior military medical. Grace said nothing. Marcy looked up. What kind of military medical? Field. The answer was flat, not rude, not warm. Marcy waited for more. Grace gave her nothing. A resident standing nearby looked over the rim of his tablet. He was young, clean-faced, still carrying the alert nervousness of someone who had not yet learned how much he did not know. His badge read, Owen Clark, field where he asked. Grace turned her eyes to him. They were gray in the hospital light, calm enough to make his question feel louder than he had intended. Different places. Owen blinked. Right. Marcy closed the folder. This department moves fast. Grace nodded once. I noticed. There was no edge in it. No challenge. Still, Marcy studied her for an extra beat. The limp. The sealed quiet. The absence of any need to impress. Marcy had spent 21 years in emergency medicine. She trusted patterns because patterns kept people alive. Loud people were often hiding fear, but they were easy to track. Fast people could be dangerous, but they were useful if pointed in the right direction. Quiet people were harder. Some were deep wells. Some were empty rooms. Until pressure hit, you could not always tell the difference. Marcy slid a badge across the counter. Orientation starts with Tessa Miller. Try not to get killed by the supply closet. Grace clipped the badge to her scrub top. I'll do my best. Tessa Miller appeared with a half-eaten granola bar in one hand and a stack of discharge forms in the other. She was younger than Marcy, warmer by nature, with tired brown eyes that still found ways to be kind. You're Grace. Grace nodded. I'm Tessa. Welcome to the place where lunch goes to die. Grace looked at the granola bar. Looks like it put up a fight. Tessa grinned. Oh, good. You're dry. I can work with dry. She led Grace through the department naming rooms, drawers, codes, broken habits, and unofficial truths. Bay 1 was good for airway if respiratory actually answered the page. Bay 2 had a monitor that lied when the cable got bumped. Bay 3 was where Dr. Preston Vale liked to take the worst cases because the lighting was better, and because Dr. Vale liked rooms that made him look inevitable. Observation held patients the hospital had no beds for, and families who had been waiting long enough to become dangerous. The medication room door stuck unless you lifted the handle before pulling. The staff bathroom near imaging had the only mirror not lit like an interrogation room. Grace listened without interrupting. She asked few questions, but the ones she asked were exact. Where's the backup suction? Who checks the blood warmer at shift change? Which elevator is fastest to surgery when transport is blocked? Who covers triage when the waiting room turns? Tessa slowed after the fourth question. You really have done trauma. Grace opened a supply drawer, glanced inside and closed it. Yes. Tessa waited for the story that usually came after a word like that. Grace moved to the next drawer. By lunch, the department had begun to make its first version of her. That was what hospitals did. They sorted people quickly because there was never time to know anyone slowly. Grace Callahan was prior military, but probably not the kind that came with stories anyone at Lone Star wanted during a bad shift. She had a limp, which did not make her fragile, but did make people careful in the wrong way. She was organized. She was calm. She was not funny enough to be popular or loud enough to be feared. She did not volunteer credentials. She did not correct people to prove she knew better. Useful, Marcy decided. Not central. Dr. Preston Vale saw her for the first time on her fourth shift. He entered the trauma floor the way some men entered courtrooms, clean, composed, and already certain the room had been waiting for him. He was tall, dark-haired, broad through the shoulders with the expensive stillness of someone who had built his life around control. His skill was real. Everyone knew that. Families trusted him within seconds. Residents feared disappointing him. Nurses respected his hands even when they hated his mouth. That morning, an older rancher came in after being kicked in the face by a horse. Blood filled his mouth. His jaw hung wrong. His breathing had the wet, obstructed sound that made even experienced staff move faster. Owen stood near the airway cart, pale behind his mask. Pressure is holding, he said too quickly. Grace was already moving. She raised the bed, opened suction, checked the light, chose the correct tube and placed the stylet where Vale's right hand could find it without searching. She pulled the backup blade before anyone asked. The patient gurgled, eyes rolling. Vale stepped in, hands out. Who set this? Grace passed him the suction. "I did." Vale glanced at the tray, then at her. "You've done this before." "Yes." "Where?" Grace watched the patient's chest struggle against the failing airway. "He's losing time." Vale stared at her for a fraction of a second. Then he took the scope and went to work. The room tightened around him. Vale was good under direct threat. His voice became clipped, not loud. His hands moved with brutal economy. Owen held pressure on the jaw. Tessa passed medication. Grace kept suction clear and adjusted the patient's head a quarter inch before Vale asked for it. The tube passed. Chest rise returned. The monitor settled enough for the room to breathe. After the patient was stabilized, Owen pulled off his gloves and looked at Grace as if seeing a slightly different person than the one who had walked in that morning. "Nice setup," he said. Grace was rewrapping the airway drawer. It was missing a 10-milliliter syringe. Owen looked at the drawer. "What? It's back now." Vale removed his gown near the trash and watched her for a moment. "Callahan." She looked up. "Next time when I ask where you learned something, answer." Tessa went still. Grace folded the empty packaging once before throwing it away. "Next time, ask after the airway is secure." For 1 second, nobody moved. Vale's face did not change much, but the air did. Then he smiled without warmth. "Careful." Grace met his eyes. "I was." She walked out before the silence could decide what shape it wanted. That should have made the department respect her. In a better place, maybe it would have. At Lone Star, it made people curious. Curiosity in a hospital was rarely clean. By the end of the week, Owen had asked 3 people whether anyone knew where Grace had served. Tessa had invited Grace for drinks twice and been politely refused twice. A paramedic named Dylan had leaned against the counter one night and asked if the limp was from sports a car wreck or something cooler. Grace had been hanging antibiotics at the time. "Getting older," she said. Dylan laughed. "You're not old." Grace looked at him. Older than some things. He never figured out whether she was joking. The limp became a quiet piece of department weather. It was mentioned in side glances, adjusted assignments, softened instructions. Nobody said she could not handle the trauma bays. They said other things. "Callahan is good with families. Put her in observation. She settles people. She's steady on discharge. She can manage overflow." Grace accepted every assignment without protest. She moved through the edges of the department and learned it better than the people standing in the middle. She learned Marcy's rhythms. The charge nurse got sharper when scared, but not less accurate. Her anger was often math wearing a human voice. She learned Owen's tells. He stared at monitors when he was afraid to touch the patient. If someone gave him one concrete task, he improved immediately. She learned Tessa's danger. Tessa cared so fast that emotion sometimes reached her hands before training did. She learned Dr. Vale. He trusted skill when it looked the way he expected skill to look. Fast hands, clear voice, visible certainty. Anything quieter made him uneasy. She learned the floor itself. Which curtain track jammed. Which oxygen port failed under pressure. Which hallway became useless when 2 stretchers crossed at once. Where families gathered when grief needed a target. Where sound changed when a patient stopped breathing behind a closed curtain. On her second week, a pediatric airway cart vanished after environmental services moved equipment for floor waxing. 3 nurses argued near the desk. "I saw it outside 6. "No, that was the adult crash cart." "Who signed it out?" Grace walked away. Less than a minute later, she returned pushing the cart from a corridor near observation. 2 drawers were open. She had already restocked them. Marcy saw her. "You found it. It was behind linen. You checked the drawers, too. If one thing is wrong, 2 things are usually wrong." Marcy looked at the cart, then at Grace. Efficient. Tessa leaned close after Marcy walked away. "That is basically a love poem from her." Grace allowed the smallest smile. She should work on meter. There were moments like that. Small ones. Human ones. They passed quickly because the department did not leave much room for anything that did not bleed alarm or demand a signature. A teenage boy came in with a deep cut across his forearm after punching a window during a fight with his stepfather. He cursed at everyone who came near him. Owen tried to examine the wound and got told exactly where he could put his medical degree. Marcy threatened security. Tessa tried kindness and got bitten by words meant to wound. Grace pulled a stool beside the bed. The boy glared at her. "What?" She set a packet of gauze on the tray. "You're bleeding on my clean floor." He blinked, thrown off. "I don't care." I noticed. His mouth twitched before he could stop it. Grace nodded at the wound. "Glass still in there." "How should I know?" "Because it hurts different when there's glass." He looked away. "Maybe." She lowered her voice. "You can be angry. You can hate everyone in this building if it helps. But your hand is still yours, and I need you to keep it." The boy stared at her, then slowly placed his arm on the tray. Marcy watched from the station without appearing to watch. Later, she assigned Grace to family overflow again. "You're good with difficult people," Marcy said. Grace looked toward the trauma bays. "I'm good with trauma." Marcy's eyes flicked to her leg before she stopped herself. "I need full mobility in the center lanes." Grace absorbed the sentence. Understood. She walked away. That night, alone in her apartment above a closed bakery on the south side, Grace sat on the edge of her bed, with one hand braced against the mattress, and waited for the pain in her leg to finish speaking. The apartment was spare. One table, 2 chairs, a narrow bed, coffee on the counter. A line of uniforms in the closet hung with exact spacing. No photographs on the walls. No medals. No framed certificates. No old unit patches displayed under glass. In the back of the closet sat a locked hard case. Grace did not look at it. Rain pressed against the window in soft bursts. Traffic whispered on the wet street below. Somewhere far off, thunder rolled low enough to become another kind of memory. Her leg throbbed from hip to knee, deep and electric. She breathed through it once. Then again. Pain to Grace was information. Not identity. Not a request for sympathy. It told her what to adjust, what to protect, how much she could spend before the body started collecting debt. She rose, filled a glass of water, and stood in the kitchen until the flare eased. At 5:10 the next morning, she was back at Lone Star, checking the seal on a crash cart, while the sky outside turned from black to bruised purple. Owen found her near the ambulance bay later that week. She stood with a paper cup of coffee, untouched in her hand, watching a helicopter move north across the morning haze. "You ever miss it?" he asked. Grace did not ask what he meant. The helicopter dipped behind a line of buildings. "I miss knowing exactly what people were trained for." Owen laughed softly. "Yeah, residency will do that to you." Grace looked at him. He stopped laughing. A call came in before either of them could say anything else. By late September, the department had settled into its opinion of Grace Callahan. Dependable, calm, private, useful under pressure, but not the person you built the room around. Dr. Vale said it most clearly during a staffing review at the Central Board. Marcy was scanning names with a dry erase marker in her hand. "We're thin after 3. Tessa is late and Ortiz called out." Vale took the assignment sheet. "Put Callahan on lower acuity until the evening rush." Marcy frowned. "She can handle more than lower acuity." "I didn't say she couldn't handle it." Grace stood close enough to hear him. Vale did not lower his voice. "I said I'm not discovering her limit in the middle of a collapse." Marcy looked toward Grace, then back at the board. "Fair." Grace signed for controlled medications, checked the blood fridge log, and walked away. No expression. No argument. Inside, she marked the information because information mattered. Now she knew where Vale placed her when pressure rose. At the edge. Away from the sharpest decisions. In some rooms that was an insult. In others, it was vantage. The department kept giving her proof. At 11:40 one morning, she caught a potassium order mismatch before pharmacy sent it up. At 12:15, she noticed a woman's oxygen saturation dropping by the color around her mouth before the monitor alarmed. At 1:05, she stepped between a grieving brother and a resident before grief turned into a fist. At 2:30, she got a line into a dehydrated child after 2 missed attempts and handed him a purple ice pop afterward. The child sniffed hard, trying not to cry. "I hate shots." Grace taped the line. "That's reasonable. You don't care. I care. I just don't require you to be impressed. The boy studied her. My mom says I have to be brave. Grace looked at him seriously. Brave people complain all the time. He seemed to consider that a relief. His mother mouthed, "Thank you." Grace nodded and moved on. She never stayed long enough to become the center of anyone's gratitude. That bothered some people. They did not know what to do with someone who did not convert competence into performance. Tessa tried again to pull her into the social life of the department. "Come out Friday," she said, leaning against the medication room door. "One drink. You don't even have to like us." Grace scanned a label. "I have an early morning." "You always have an early morning. That is how mornings work." Tessa laughed. Grace almost smiled. "Fine," Tessa said. "But one day I'm getting you into a place with bad music and fried food." Grace hung the medication bag. "One day is very crowded." There were cracks in the wall around her, but they were narrow. You had to be still to see through them. Most people at Lone Star were not still. Then came the night of the bus accident. A church van rolled outside New Braunfels during a storm, sending 6 patients to Lone Star in under 20 minutes. None were as badly injured as the radio first suggested, but the department did not know that when the call came in. For 14 minutes, the floor braced for children dying in wet clothes. The worst patient was a 12-year-old girl with a scalp laceration, a broken wrist, and fear so complete she could not speak. Her father arrived 10 minutes later, soaked through, wild-eyed, demanding to see her. Security blocked him because no one had cleared him. His voice rose. Marcy snapped. Owen tried to explain policy and made it worse. Grace came out of the room and stepped between them. The father stared down at her. "Get out of my way." Grace did not move. "Her name is Lily." His face changed. "Yes, she is awake. She is scared. Her wrist is broken. Her head is bleeding, but she is talking with her eyes, and she needs you calm before she sees your face." The man's anger collapsed into terror. "She's okay." Grace chose the truth carefully. "She is here. She is breathing. She is asking for you without words." His mouth trembled. Grace held his gaze. "You get one deep breath before you go in. Not for us, for her." He obeyed. Marcy watched from behind the desk, lips pressed together. Later, when the rush settled, she found Grace restocking gauze in the supply room. "You always that calm." Grace placed a stack of dressings on the shelf. "No, could have fooled me." Grace looked at the packages in her hands. Calm and quiet aren't the same thing. Marcy stood there longer than she needed to. For one brief moment, curiosity almost became concern. Then a monitor alarm sounded and Marcy turned back into the noise. That was Lone Star. People sensed depth in Grace, then got pulled away before they had time to measure it. The only person who seemed willing to measure anything was Dr. Samuel Hart, an older trauma physician who worked part-time after a tremor ended his surgical career. He wore reading glasses on a chain, walked slowly, and saw too much. One afternoon, he watched Grace reset a splint on a warehouse worker's fractured arm. Her hands were exact. Not gentle for show, accurate. The kind of accurate that came from doing important things in places where second attempts cost too much. After the patient left for imaging, Hart came beside her. "You were trained by people who expected precision under pressure." Grace peeled off her gloves. "Most training expects that." Hart smiled faintly. "Most training says it expects that." Grace dropped the gloves into the bin. Hart adjusted his glasses. "There are easier ways to stop this department from underestimating you." Grace reached for a new roll of tape. "That isn't my goal." "I know." He looked towards the trauma bays, where Vale was correcting Owen in a voice just quiet enough to be cruel. "That is why they keep doing it." Grace said nothing. Hart walked away. By October, San Antonio cooled only in theory. The afternoon still baked the ambulance bay. The trauma floor filled with heat stroke crashes, falls, chest pain overdoses, and the private disasters people carried into public rooms. Grace became part of the department's machinery, a quiet figure at the edge of rooms, a steady hand, a limp in the hallway, a woman no one had correctly named. The day began like any other overburdened Tuesday. Too many patients, too few beds, coffee gone cold before anyone finished it. Marcy at the board veil in surgery, Owen chasing signatures, Tessa arguing with radiology about a delayed scan. Grace stood at the intake desk updating discharge notes when the EMS radio cracked alive. The dispatcher's voice came through hard and clipped. Multiple vehicle collision Interstate 10 eastbound. Entrapment, blunt trauma, possible internal injuries, several units inbound. Grace lifted her eyes from the screen. Across the department, Marcy reached for the dry erase marker. The first ambulance was 7 minutes out. 7 minutes was not time. It was a shrinking room. It was the distance between preparation and regret. It was the gap where good teams found rhythm and bad teams found excuses. Marcy Reed raised the dry erase marker and began cutting the department into pieces. Bay 3 for the hypotensive driver. Bay 2 for chest trauma. Observation takes walking wounded after clearance. Tessa clear the family room. Owen find Vale. Nobody parks a stretcher in my ambulance lane unless they want to explain it to God. Owen looked up from the chart in his hands. Dr. Vale is still in post-op review. Then go make him lesson post-op review. Owen moved fast enough to nearly collide with a respiratory therapist coming out of Bay 4. The therapist cursed under her breath and kept going. Grace remained at intake for 1 beat longer, eyes on the radio fingers resting lightly beside the keyboard. She listened to the dispatcher's voice under the static. Second unit reports prolonged extrication. Male driver mid-40s restrained steering column intrusion, blood pressure falling in transport. Diminished breath sounds left side. Abdomen firm. Marcy looked toward her. Callahan, stay at intake. I need someone who can keep the board honest. Grace nodded. I can do that. The words were simple. The room around them was not. The waiting area had already begun to sense danger before anyone announced it. People always did. They heard the change in staff voices. They saw nurses stop walking and start moving with purpose. A woman, holding an ice pack to her forehead, sat straighter. A father pulled his little girl closer on his lap. The old man, with chest pressure, looked toward the ambulance doors as if whatever was coming might take his place. The first siren bent around the building. Grace watched the ambulance bay camera mounted above the intake screen. Red light washed across the pavement. The rig backed in hard doors, opening before the wheels fully stopped. Tessa came past the station pushing a stretcher toward observation. Family room is cleared, mostly. One uncle is threatening to call a lawyer. Marcy did not look up. Tell him I hope the lawyer has a bed. Tessa vanished down the corridor. Grace wrote the incoming number on the board and marked Bay 3 in red. The trauma floor changed under pressure. It always did. The chatter thinned. The jokes stopped. The useless bodies became visible. People who knew their jobs found lanes. People who did not began asking questions too close to the beds. Dr. Preston Vale entered from the surgery corridor at a fast walk, pulling his gloves on as he came. His expression was controlled, but his eyes were already sorting the room. What do we have? Marcy answered without turning from the board. Interstate collision. Multiple vehicles. First critical is restrained driver pressure falling possible chest and abdominal involvement. Bay 3. Vale glanced toward the bay. Grace was already inside it. She had not been assigned there. She had simply looked at the mechanism, the field report, and the empty bed, then moved. By the time Vale reached the threshold, the room had been stripped of clutter. The ultrasound was plugged in. Suction was tested. The chest tube tray sat sealed on the side table. Pressure infuser hung ready. Rapid transfusion tubing lay open but controlled. A central line kit rested where Vale's right hand could find it. Trauma shears were already placed at the lower rail. Vale stopped just long enough to notice. Who told you to prep all this? Grace checked the oxygen connection. The report did. Vale's mouth tightened. That is not an answer. It is the only one we have time for. Owen entered behind him slightly breathless. "I can take primary survey." Vale did not look away from Grace. "You stay where I put you, Callahan." Grace met his eyes. "Yes, doctor." She did not leave. The ambulance doors burst open. The paramedics rolled the driver in, with one medic kneeling on the stretcher rail to maintain pressure at the patient's left side. The man was conscious enough to fight the mask, not conscious enough to understand why fighting was killing him faster. Blood had soaked his shirt and dried in dark patches along his ribs. His left leg lay at an angle that made Owen look away and then force himself to look back. Male. 46, the paramedic called. Restrained driver pinned approximately 15 minutes. Pressure dropped from 90 systolic to 68 en route. Diminished breath sounds on the left. Abdomen rigid. 2 large bore lines placed. 1 liter saline, no response. "On my count," Marcy said from the doorway. They transferred him. Grace's hands locked under the sheet controlling shoulder and hip, so the man did not slide. The movement was small exact and nearly invisible under all the noise. The patient landed, centered on the bed. Owen reached for monitor leads. Grace already had them. She placed them across the chest while Tessa cut away the remaining fabric. The cuff cycled. The pulse ox flashed, dropped, rose, then dropped again. Vale took the head position. "Airway is holding for now. Owen abdomen." Owen pressed too lightly. Grace saw Vale's eyes sharpen. "Commit to the exam," Vale said. Owen pressed harder. The patient groaned. Grace handed Vale the ultrasound probe. He took it, glanced at her, then placed it against the patient's abdomen. The screen bloomed black in the wrong places. Too much fluid. Too much silence in the image. Vale inhaled through his nose. "He is bleeding." Grace had known that from the doorway. His skin had already said it. His breath had said it. The way his body guarded the left side had said it before the screen confirmed it. But being first was not useful unless it changed the next move. "Blood," Grace said. Tessa was already at the warmer. "Coming." The patient's pressure dropped again. The monitor screamed. Owen stared at the numbers for half a second too long. Grace spoke from the bedside. "Look at him, Owen, not the screen." His eyes snapped to the chest. The left side lagged behind the right. The movement had worsened. "Chest is tighter," Owen said. "Say it to Vale." Owen swallowed. "Left chest movement is worsening." Vale's hand moved to the ribs. "Prep chest tube." Grace had the tray open before the sentence finished. A tech at the foot of the bed fumbled with tubing. Blood backed up, then stopped. Grace did not turn her head. "Tubing is kinked." The tech looked down, corrected it, and the red line surged. "Pressure bag," Grace said. "Got it," Tessa answered. The room tightened, adjusted, moved. For 1 minute, it almost became clean. Then the second ambulance arrived. A young woman from the pileup came in screaming, one arm broken, scalp bleeding, glass caught in her hair. Her mother came behind her until security stopped her. Another EMS unit called in with a teenage passenger whose confusion was worsening. A fourth unit reported an older woman with chest bruising and shortness of breath. The department swelled until the walls felt too close. Marcy stepped away from Bay 3 and took control of the wider floor. Bay 2 takes the teenager. Observation clears 2 beds. Tessa, after blood is running, I need you in 2. Owen stays with Vale. Callahan intake. Grace looked at the driver, then at the chest tray. Vale followed her gaze. I need fast hands in here, he said. Grace's voice stayed even. I have fast hands. Vale finally looked at her fully. I need people who can pivot without becoming another obstacle. The sentence struck the room harder than he intended, or maybe exactly as hard as he intended. Tessa's shoulders stiffened. Owen glanced at Grace and then away. Marcy heard it. Her face changed, but only by a fraction. Grace held the chest tube tray for 1 breath. Then she placed it on the stand with deliberate care. Thoracic decompression is prepared. Suction is live. Your clamp is right side of the tray. Vale's jaw flexed. Intake Callahan. Grace turned. She walked out of Bay 3 with the same measured stride she had walked in with. The limp showed under the hard lights. For a moment, it became what everyone had made it again. A reason, a question. A soft excuse for moving her away from the sharp center of the room. At the nurse's station, Grace picked up the radio handset as another patch came through. She wrote fast. Teenage male altered mental status blood from right ear. Female 60s chest bruising stable pressure pain with inspiration. Rideshare driver clavicle deformity possible abdominal tenderness. Off-duty mechanic struck while assisting lower leg trauma. The board filled with names, ages, room numbers, half answers. The edge of the department became a battlefield of its own. A woman at the counter demanded to know why her husband had not been seen. A child vomited into a plastic basin. The feverish toddler from earlier wailed in a thin, exhausted rhythm against his mother's chest. A police officer asked where to put a patient in custody. 2 paramedics arrived with paperwork and nowhere to leave it. Grace cleared a section of counter with one sweep of her arm, moving loose labels, empty saline flush wrappers, and coffee cups into a bin. Reports here, she told the paramedics. Verbal first, paper second. One of them blinked, relieved to be ordered. Female driver, 63 stable pressure seatbelt sign, short of breath. Grace looked over his shoulder at the woman on the stretcher. The patient was sitting upright, insisting she was fine. Her face had the pinched control of someone using pride as a splint. Her lips were pale. Each breath was shallow enough to hide pain from people who trusted numbers too much. "Bring her back now," Grace said. The triage nurse frowned. "Her pressure is stable." Grace stepped around the desk and placed a hand on the stretcher rail. The woman tried to smile. "I'm all right, honey. Take care of somebody worse." Grace leaned close enough that the woman did not have to perform for the room. "I know you want to be brave. Right now, I need you honest. Every breath hurts more than you are admitting." The woman's eyes filled. Her daughter, standing behind the stretcher, whispered, "Mom." The woman nodded once. "It hurts bad." Grace turned to the triage nurse. Bay 2 after the teenager clears imaging. Until then, monitored hall space with oxygen and repeat pressure every 5 minutes. The triage nurse hesitated. Grace's voice stayed low. Now, the stretcher moved. Across the room, Marcy saw it and said nothing. 10 minutes later, imaging confirmed the woman had a worsening internal chest injury under numbers that had looked safe enough to wait. No one announced that Grace had caught it. Emergency departments did not pause for clean acknowledgments. They survived then, forgot in ways that favored whoever had held the loudest authority. Grace returned to the board. A newer nurse named Emily reached for a medication bag from the refrigerator and moved toward observation too quickly. Grace looked up without lifting her head. That concentration stays in pharmacy. Emily froze. She checked the label. Her face drained. "I thought it was the other one." "You thought fast. Check slow." Emily nodded and backed away. The radio cracked again. Grace answered. Outside, sirens stacked on top of each other. Inside, the department broke into smaller storms. In Bay 3, the driver's pressure slid and recovered and slid again. Vale fought the bleeding with skill and irritation. Owen called out numbers with a voice that grew steadier each time Grace reminded him from across the station to say the patient, not the panic. Pressure 74/40. Chest output. Owen looked. 200 and climbing. "Say that to Vale." He did. Vale did not look toward Grace, but he heard her. In Bay 2, the teenage passenger became combative confusion turning into fear. Tessa tried to hold his arm while respiratory adjusted oxygen. The patient swung wild and caught the bed rail. Grace stepped in long enough to lower her voice near his ear. "You are in San Antonio. You were in a crash. Your body is trying to protect you by fighting the wrong people." His eyes snapped to her. "My brother. We are looking for him. I need to get up." "No, you need to stay alive long enough to be useful." For some reason, that reached him. He stopped pulling for 3 seconds. It was enough for Tessa to secure the line. Grace left before the gratitude could gather. At 4:12, the off-duty mechanic arrived with a crushed lower leg and dirt embedded in his cheek. He kept apologizing to the paramedics for bleeding on their stretcher. Grace guided him into monitored hall space. Name: Luis. Luis, you stopped to help. Carr had kids. Then stop apologizing for the blood. He laughed once, then groaned. Grace checked his foot. Cool, but not gone. Pulse faint. Marcy Grace called. I need ortho aware on hall 4, lower limb compromise. Marcy was on the phone, arguing with bed control. We have no rooms. Then he gets the next surgical eye before he loses the foot. Marcy looked at her. Grace held the gaze. Marcy covered the phone. Owen. Owen appeared from bay, 3 gloves bloody. Can you check hall 4? Vale snapped from inside the bay. Owen stays. Grace answered before Marcy had to choose. I can hold hall 4 until ortho sees him. Vale's voice came through the curtain. You can hold intake. Grace did not move for half a second. Then she turned to Luis. I'll be back in 90 seconds. Luis tried to smile. You look like you keep promises. Grace did not answer. She was not sure she liked that about him. The next 90 seconds became 9 minutes. The hospital was running out of clean rooms, open hands, and emotional bandwidth. The waiting room pressed against the front desk like weather against a weak window. Families wanted names. Patients wanted time. Staff wanted instructions that made the impossible feel divided into pieces. Grace divided it. She assigned a paramedic crew to hold pressure on a wound until a nurse freed up. She moved a stable ankle fracture out of a monitored slot. She told security to redirect families away from the ambulance corridor before grief found the wrong door. She found 2 portable monitors in a storage alcove no one had checked. She sent Emily to restock pressure bags, then stopped her at the corner. Breathe first. Emily stared. I'm fine. Your hands are shaking. Emily looked down as if her own body had betrayed her. Grace took the saline flushes from her. 1 breath in, 1 out, then move. Emily obeyed. Grace handed the flushes back. Now, the young nurse went. At 4:33, the older woman with the seatbelt injury worsened. Her breathing shortened. Her daughter started crying into a phone. Tessa called for Vale, but he was still buried in Bay 3. Grace reached the bedside first. The woman's eyes were wide now, pride gone. I can't catch it. Grace placed a hand on her shoulder. I know, look at me. The woman tried. Small breath. Again, do not chase the air. Let it come shallow. Tessa arrived with supplies. Chest is getting worse. Grace nodded. Call respiratory. Tell Marcy we need a room with suction now. There isn't one. Grace looked toward Bay 1. A stable patient waited there for discharge transport fully dressed, irritated, holding a plastic bag of belongings. There is. Tessa followed her gaze. Marcy will kill us. No, she will understand after. Grace walked into Bay 1. The patient looked up. I've been waiting 3 hours. Grace took the chart from the door. You are going to wait in a chair with a blanket and a sandwich. What? Grace met his eyes. Because the woman outside your room is running out of air. The man stared at her. Then he looked past her to the hall. His anger faded into embarrassment. I can sit. Thank you. Within 2 minutes, Bay 1 became a chest room. Marcy appeared at the doorway just as respiratory arrived. Callahan. Grace was already placing the oxygen tubing. Marcy took in the scene, the moved patient, the freed suction, the woman's gray face. Her mouth tightened. Next time, tell me before you rearrange my floor. Grace adjusted the bed. Next time, have a floor. For the first time that day, Tessa almost laughed and almost cried at the same time. Marcy pointed at her. Do not encourage her. The woman stabilized enough to move to imaging. Grace returned to intake with sweat at the base of her neck and pain starting to wake in her right leg. It began deep in the hip, a slow burn that spread downward with every pivot. She shortened her stride before anyone could notice. She shifted weight through the left side. She made the adjustment automatic. Pain was weather. Respect it, move anyway. At 4:51, Owen came out of Bay 3 to grab supplies. His face was pale above his mask. Grace saw the look before he spoke. What did you miss? He stopped. I didn't say I missed anything. You have that face. He swallowed. Chest output increased. Vale thinks there is more abdominal loss. I keep losing the trend. Grace handed him a new pack of labels and a roll of tape. "You are trying to hold the whole patient in your head." Owen let out a breath that sounded too close to a confession. "Yes. Do not. Hold the next decision. Airway breathing circulation. Then repeat." He nodded. From Bay 3, Vale barked his name. Owen turned to go, then stopped. "Why does he keep pushing you out?" Grace looked at the board. "Because he thinks the center is safer without questions he cannot classify." Owen stared at her. Grace handed him the tape. "Go." He went. At 5:06, the last major unit from the interstate arrived. A compact car passenger with abdominal pain that had hidden under adrenaline until it could not. The patient was 22, a college student wearing a shirt from a campus volunteer event. She kept asking if her friend was alive. No one had an answer. Grace took report, placed her in monitored hall space, and watched the girl's hands. Not her face. Hands lied less. They tightened before the voice broke. They trembled before the blood pressure fell. The girl said she was okay. Her fingers curled around the sheet like she was holding herself together manually. Grace touched her wrist. "What is your friend's name?" "Brianna." "I am going to write that down. Is she here?" "I do not know yet." The girl began to cry silently. Grace wrote the name on the top of the chart in block letters. Brianna. It mattered, not clinically, humanly. Sometimes those were the same thing if you stayed in the room long enough to see it. At 5:18, Marcy rubbed the bridge of her nose with two gloved fingers and looked at the board. No more major entrapments, the dispatcher said over the radio. Secondary units clearing. Last transport en route to another facility. The department did not relax. It only shifted from drowning to treading water. Vale stepped out of Bay 3 with blood on his gown and a streak of sweat at his temple. The driver was alive, barely moving toward surgery with Owen and a transport team. Vale stripped off one glove and scanned the board. "Where is Callahan?" Grace was at the intake desk finishing a pressure trend. Marcy pointed without looking. Vale walked over. For one brief second, Grace thought he might acknowledge what she had been doing from the station. He did not. "Lower acuity turnover," he said. "We have nowhere to put the next wave." Grace looked at the board. "The next wave is not coming from the interstate." Vale frowned. "What?" She listened. At first, the sound was almost nothing. A pressure under the floor. A low vibration through tile and bone. The paper cup beside the printer trembled. The fluid in a half-empty water bottle formed small rings against the plastic. Tessa looked up from a chart. "Did you feel that?" Owen, returning from the surgery corridor, glanced toward the ceiling. "Generator." Grace's hand went still above the keyboard. "No." The vibration deepened. Somewhere near the ambulance entrance, a metal tray rattled against a counter. The windows shivered in their frames. The waiting room quieted by instinct conversations thinning as people turned toward the glass. Marcy looked at Grace. "What is it?" Grace listened past the monitor, past the intercom, past the strained breathing of the department. The rhythm came in layered waves. Not traffic, not construction, not a generator. Rotor blades. More than one aircraft. Heavy, low, loaded. Her face changed before she could stop it. Vale noticed. "What?" Grace looked toward the south lot. The sound grew teeth. The automatic doors at the far end of the ambulance corridor opened and shut against a pressure they were not built to hold. Dust lifted from the threshold. A child in the waiting room began to cry, hands pressed over his ears. A security guard ran in from the side entrance. "There are helicopters coming down outside." Marcy straightened. "Medical transport." The guard shook his head. "Military." Grace stayed very still. A second pulse of rotor thunder rolled over the hospital hard enough to make the fluorescent lights flicker. Vale turned toward the corridor with anger rising to cover confusion. "This is a civilian trauma center. They do not land here without clearance." Grace's eyes stayed on the doors. Outside, the evening light broke apart under spinning dust. The first Blackhawk settled into the south lot. It did not land gently. It came down hard through a storm of dust paper grit and hot evening air, its rotor wash tearing across the pavement and slamming loose trash against the ambulance bay doors. The hospital windows trembled in their frames. A metal sign near the visitor entrance bent backward, snapped free from one bolt and clattered across the sidewalk until it struck the curb. Inside Lone Star Regional, the whole emergency department paused. Not stopped. Never stopped. Patients still moaned. Monitors still called out in sharp electronic tones. Someone behind curtain 4 kept vomiting into a basin. A woman in the waiting room whispered the same prayer over and over into her closed hands. But beneath all of that, something larger had entered the building before the doors even opened. Weight. Urgency. The kind of sound that did not ask permission. Grace Callahan stood near the intake desk with one hand flat on the counter. The vibration traveled through her palm up her wrist into the old bones of memory she had spent years trying not to touch. Heavy bird. Loaded. Hard approach. Not transport, not drill, not ordinary medevac. Extraction under pressure. A second helicopter dropped lower outside. The windows rattled again. Fluorescent lights flickered once, then steadied with a louder hum. The little boy in the waiting room began crying harder, his face buried against his mother's scrub jacket. Dr. Preston Vale strode toward the ambulance corridor, anger already shaping his mouth. "Security," he snapped. "Who cleared that landing?" The security guard near the inner doors had one hand against his radio and one hand pressed to his earpiece. His eyes were wide. "Nobody through our side, doctor." "Then stop them at the entrance." The guard looked toward the shaking glass. Grace knew before he said it. There would be no stopping them at the entrance. Marcy Reed came around the nurse's station with her dry erase marker still in her hand. The marker cap was clenched between two fingers, forgotten. "Callahan," she said. Grace did not move. Marcy followed her gaze toward the ambulance corridor. "You know what this is." The second Blackhawk's rotor wash hit the building hard enough to send dust down from the top seam of the double doors. Grace's voice was quiet. "Yes." Tessa, standing 2 steps behind her with a stack of trauma forms, looked from Grace to the doors. "What does that mean?" Grace did not answer. The outer doors opened. Wind came in first, then noise, then men. The first through was tall, broad, and covered in dust from the knees down. His flight suit was darkened with sweat at the spine, and blood had dried along one cuff. He moved with command, but not the clean kind people practiced in conference rooms. This was command worn down to its useful edge. Every step had a purpose. Every glance counted something. Behind him, 4 military medics pushed a transport litter built for violence instead of comfort. The patient on it was wrapped in tan thermal blankets that had gone dark in more than one place. Combat dressings covered his left chest and lower abdomen. One had failed, completely blood spreading beneath the tape in a slow black bloom. His face was half hidden by oxygen tubing grime and a beard cut close to the jaw. A monitor bounced beside him with numbers that kept trying to fall off the bottom of survivable. Another medic followed with a pressure bag held high in one shaking hand. A second litter came behind them. Then voices from outside. More casualties in the lot. More hands. More blood. The smell hit the trauma floor at once. Hot metal, aviation fuel, dust, field dressings, blood that had been trapped too long under fabric and heat. Dr. Vale stepped into the center of the corridor like a man placing himself between order and violation. "I'm Dr. Preston Vale," he said. "Lead trauma surgeon. You brief me now." The officer did not look at the trauma board. He did not look at Marcy. He did not look at Owen, who had come up beside the desk with his face suddenly young and unprotected. The officer scanned the room once. Then he shouted over the fading rotor thunder. "Where is Harbor 6? No one answered. The question did not fit the room. Marcy blinked. Tessa looked toward the physician board as if the name might be written there. Owen mouthed the words silently, trying to place them. Vale took another step forward. "You have a critical casualty. You speak to me." The officer finally turned his head toward him. "Are you Harbor 6? Vale's expression hardened. "No, I am the trauma surgeon." "Then move." The words landed flat and final. For half a second, the only sound inside the corridor was the monitor on the litter screaming a rhythm no one wanted to hear. Vale's face went still. Pride did that sometimes when it had not yet decided whether to become rage. "This is a civilian trauma center," he said. "You do not storm through my doors and dictate procedure." The officer stepped closer until they were almost chest to chest. Training, breach collapse near Camp Bullis. Secondary fragmentation. Lower structure failure. Delayed extraction. Base surgical intake lost capacity 30 minutes ago. My first window closed. My second one is bleeding out in your hallway. He pointed toward the man on the litter without looking away from Vale. "I did not bring my people here to die inside your policy." The sentence cut through the room. Marcy's face changed first, not softening, recalculating. "What is your name?" she asked. "Major Daniel Cross." "Major Cross, we do not have anyone named Harbor 6 on staff." Cross looked at her. "Check again. There is no physician by that name. I did not ask for a physician." That changed the air. Grace felt it pass through the department like a cold wire. The hierarchy everyone trusted had just failed to answer the question being asked. The patient on the litter jerked once, not a full movement. More like the body trying to resist collapse, even after the mind had begun to sink. The medic at his side pressed harder into the low abdominal dressing. Fresh blood pushed between his fingers. "Pressure is dropping," the medic said. Vale turned sharply. "Move him to Bay 3. Cross blocked the litter with one hand on the rail. "Not until I know who is running him." Vale stared at him. "You are wasting time." Cross's jaw tightened. "I know exactly what time costs." Grace set down the pen in her hand. It made almost no sound. Still, Tessa heard it. Grace stepped out from behind the intake desk. Her leg protested on the first step. She ignored it. The rotor vibration had awakened the deep ache in the old injury, but pain had no vote in the matter. She walked toward the litter, not fast, not dramatic, simply direct. The corridor seemed to lengthen under her. Eyes found her limp. They had always found it. They found it now, too, but the meaning had shifted. Under the emergency lights and fading dust, her uneven stride no longer read as limitation. It read as something paid for. Major Cross saw her before the rest of the room understood. His eyes went first to her watch. Battered black casing, scratched face, worn band. Then to her hands. Then to the way she looked at the patient before she looked at anyone's rank. Something in his face opened and closed again quickly. "Ma'am," he said. The word was not loud. It did not need to be. Every head turned. Vale looked from Cross to Grace, disbelief tightening the muscles around his mouth. Marcy's eyes narrowed. Tessa stopped breathing. Grace reached the litter. She did not greet Cross. She did not explain herself. She placed 2 fingers against the patient's neck and found the pulse buried under shock and blood loss. Her other hand moved to the center of his chest, then to the left side, dressing, then down to the pelvis where the blanket was wettest. "How long in flight?" she asked. Cross answered instantly. 19 minutes from extraction point. Rough route. 1 transient pulse loss in the bird. Came back with compressions and blood. Needle decompression attempted. The medic near the pressure bag shook his head. Negative. Primary concern was abdominal source and pelvic instability. Grace peeled one edge of the chest dressing back. The skin beneath was bruised and tight. She watched him breathe once, then again. The left side lagged. Not enough for the untrained eye to trust. Enough for hers. She looked at his neck. The effort in his throat. The angle of his trachea. The tension beneath the clavicle. "He is not only bleeding," she said. Vale stepped toward her. "Callahan, step away from that patient." Grace did not turn. "What is his mechanism?" Cross answered her, not Vale. "Support column failure during live breach lane. Lower torso pinned. Secondary fragmentation. He dragged 2 men clear before the second fall. We controlled what we could in the field. Could not stop abdominal loss." The words struck something under Grace's ribs. Dragged 2 men clear. Of course he had. She looked down at the patient's face. The blood and dust had hidden him at first. The beard was darker than she remembered. The lines around his eyes were deeper. But the set of the jaw was the same. The old scar near his left eyebrow was still there, faint beneath the grime. Master Sergeant Caleb Mercer, Night Watch. For one brief second, the hallway fell away. Heat, sand, a red light inside a field tent. Men shouting grid coordinates over broken radio. A sniper with patient eyes refusing morphine until his spotter was loaded first. Then Lone Star returned. The monitor screamed. Grace leaned closer. Night Watch. The word barely crossed the space between them. Mercer's eyelids flickered. The medic at the rail sucked in a breath. Another soldier in the doorway whispered not to the room but to memory. Harbor 6. Owen let out a short, stunned sound and immediately swallowed it. Marcy took one step forward. "Grace," she said slowly, "who are you?" Grace kept her fingers against Mercer's pulse. Cross answered because Grace would not. She held casualty routing together outside Kandahar when every channel went dark. When the maps failed, she built new ones. When air could not land, she found ground routes. When ground routes burned, she found hands. He looked at Vale. "Doctor, she is the reason men who should have died in dirt made it to people like you." Silence spread outward from that sentence. Not peaceful silence. Impact silence. Vale's eyes stayed on Grace. "She is a nurse in my emergency department." Cross's voice dropped. "She is the woman I asked for." A second litter rolled farther into the corridor. The soldier on it was semi-conscious, fighting weakly against the straps with one arm. Blood had dried in his hairline. One trouser leg had been cut away. A medic shouted vitals from behind the litter, but the words tangled with another voice calling for oxygen near the doors. Marcy looked toward the south entrance. How many total? Cross did not look away from Grace. 12 red. 7 yellow in the lot. 2 airway concerns. 2 unstable pelvis. 1 possible compartment syndrome. 1 blast lung going bad. Grace's eyes tracked the corridor, the stretchers, the available rooms, the civilian patients still waiting, the staff frozen in the wrong kind of awe. "Yellow tags stay outside until we can absorb them," she said. "Walking wounded do not enter this floor unless airway changes or pressure drops. Put your senior medic on the lot with names, mechanisms, extraction times, and last interventions. Nobody freelances." Cross nodded once. "Yes, ma'am." It was automatic. Public. The department felt it. A military major had just taken direction from the nurse Vale had sent to intake. Vale's disbelief sharpened into anger. "You do not command my floor." Grace finally looked at him. Her face had not transformed. It had clarified. The quiet was still there, but the room understood it differently now. Not hesitation. Control. "I need Bay 3, she said. "You are not taking lead." Mercer's pressure dropped again. The medic at his side swore under his breath. Grace looked down at the chest, then back at Vale. "His left chest is trapping air. He is bleeding into his abdomen and pelvis, but the chest will kill him before you finish arguing." Vale opened his mouth. Grace continued calm enough to cut deeper than anger. "You want the full pressure trend transport notes, pelvic assessment, abdominal findings, and field interventions. I will give you all of them. Right now, I need access." She held out one hand. 14 gauge. No one moved. For half a second, the hospital could not process the order because it came from the wrong person. Then Owen moved. He ran to the airway cart, pulled open the side drawer, and grabbed the needle. Vale caught his sleeve. "Owen, stop." Owen froze with the package in his hand, eyes shifting from Vale to Grace. Grace faced Vale fully. "Doctor." The title carried no insult. No submission either. Only placement. "If we spend another minute protecting your authority, he dies under it." The words landed in the exact center of the room. Marcy looked at Mercer's monitor. Then at the blood spreading beneath the blanket. Then at Grace. Her decision came before her pride could stop it. "Give it to her," Marcy said. Vale turned his head toward her. "You are taking orders from her now." Marcy's voice was tight, but it did not shake. "I am taking orders from the only person who just named what is killing him fastest." Owen handed Grace the needle. Vale stepped forward. Cross moved between them. No flourish. No threat spoken aloud. Just a body trained to become a wall. Vale's voice lowered. Move. Cross did not. Grace was already at Mercer's side. She slid one hand along the ribs, found the landmark by touch, confirmed with the chest rise, the tracheal pull, the failing oxygen, the pressure curve sliding into worse territory. Her hand was steady. Too steady for the room to call it luck. The medic holding abdominal pressure looked at her. On your count. Grace nodded. Hold him. The medic obeyed without checking with Vale. Grace inserted the needle. The hiss of trapped air cut through the corridor. Sharp. Ugly. Undeniable. For 1 second, it was louder than the rotors, louder than the alarms, louder than Vale's breathing behind Cross's shoulder. The monitor changed. Not enough. Enough. Oxygen climbed by a few points. Pressure clawed upward from the edge. Mercer's chest moved with a fraction less resistance. The medic at the rail exhaled like a prayer had been dragged out of him. Tessa pressed one hand against her own sternum. Owen stared at the monitor, then at Grace, then at the needle site as if his medical education had just rearranged itself. Grace secured the site. We bought minutes, she said, not enough. She looked at Marcy. Bay 3. Marcy turned toward the department with a voice that snapped the room back into motion. Clear 3. Move the interstate hold to observation if he is stable enough to complain. Tessa, blood warmer. Respiratory to 3 and 5. Owen, you are with Callahan until she tells you different. Vale's head turned slowly. Marcy. She did not look at him. If we are doing this, we are doing it clean. The staff scattered. Not smoothly at first. Too many bodies collided with old habits. A nurse reached for the wrong cart. A resident stepped into the path of the litter. A medic from the second team tried to push forward with his own patient, and Marcy cut him off with one hand raised. Not through my center lane unless he is dying faster than that man. The medic looked at Grace. Grace glanced once at the second casualty. Bay 5, chest first. No delay for paperwork. The medic nodded and turned. Cross shouted toward the south doors. Hold yellows outside. Red tags through this lane only. Names and mechanisms to read. Marcy looked at him. Reed. Cross pointed to her without looking away from the corridor. You are Reed. Marcy absorbed that in less than a second. Fine. Then your people listen when I speak. They will. The second litter moved to Bay 5. The third team waited at the entrance with a soldier whose face was gray beneath dust. Outside, floodlights clicked on in the south lot, pale against the thickening Texas evening. Military medics worked under rotor wash with blankets weighed down by supply bags and knees planted against the wind. Inside, Grace moved beside Mercer's litter toward Bay 3. Her limp marked each step. This time, people moved around it. Not because they pitied her, because she had direction. At the threshold of Bay 3, she spoke to Cross without slowing. Who is running your yellow tags? Staff Sergeant Ibarra. 2 medics under him. Keep them there. If an airway changes, they call before they move. If pressure drops and they cannot correct it outside, they send the patient through Marcy. Nobody storms the floor because they are scared. Cross gave one short nod. Yes, ma'am. Grace looked at him. And if you are scared, Major, use it somewhere useful. For the first time, something like pain moved across his face. Then it was gone. Yes, ma'am. Bay 3 was still dirty from the interstate driver. Blood marked the floor near the bed wheel. A discarded wrapper clung to the leg of the instrument stand. The chest tube tray Grace had prepared earlier still sat where she had left it unopened and waiting like an accusation. Tessa saw it too. Her eyes flicked to Grace. Grace did not pause. Strip the room to essentials. Fresh suction. New lines. Keep that tray. We may still need it. Owen stepped in behind her needle wrappers still clenched in one hand. What do you need me to do? Grace looked at him. For once, he did not look like he was asking permission to be present. He looked like he wanted a task sharp enough to hold. Pressure trend every 30 seconds. Say numbers clean. Do not interpret unless I ask. If you panic, say so before your hands do. Owen nodded. I can do that. I know. The words steadied him. Vale entered the room last. Cross turned slightly, but Grace lifted 2 fingers without looking back. Let him in. Vale stopped just inside the door. The old authority still clung to him, but it no longer filled the room the same way. He looked at Mercer, at the blood at the chest, at Grace. His pride had not disappeared. It had found something larger standing in front of it. Grace met his eyes. "You still have the best abdominal hands in this building." Vale blinked once. It was the last thing he expected from her. Grace stepped aside half a pace. "Use them." That was the moment the room shifted from argument to function. Not peace, not trust. Function. Mercer was transferred onto the trauma bed in a counted movement of hands, rails, lines, blood, and breath. His body was heavier than it looked. Dead weight had a truth to it, and he was too close to that truth for anyone in the room to ignore. The monitor screamed again. Owen called out, voice tight but clear. Pressure 68 over palp. Pulse 140. Oxygen 86 and rising slowly. Again, in 30, Grace said. Tessa connected blood to the warmer. First unit running. Second ready. Second ready. Respiratory moved to the head of the bed. Airway, holding but ugly. Grace looked at the chest. Tell me with his body. The therapist swallowed, then corrected herself. Left chest still lagging. Color poor. Work of breathing high. Better. Vale cut away the remaining blanket and exposed the injury field. The room saw all of it now. Lower left abdomen swollen and soaked. Pelvic binder shifted too low from transport. Bruising along the flank. Chest dressing dark. Skin cooling at the left leg. Mercer groaned, deep and involuntary, a sound dragged from somewhere below consciousness. Grace leaned close to his ear. Night Watch, listen to me. We are doing the ugly part first. His eyelids moved. Not awake. Not gone. Cross stood at the foot of the bed, jaw clenched so hard the muscles jumped. Grace looked at him once. You do not command from the foot unless I ask you to. Either give me information or give me space. Cross stepped back. Last blood 7 minutes before landing. No known anticoagulants. Allergies negative. He was alert after extraction, combative during loading, lost pressure twice in flight. Good. Vale's hands moved into the abdominal field. Fast. Precise. Cleaner now that he had stopped fighting the wrong enemy. Ultrasound, he said. Owen reached for it, but Grace had already turned the probe toward him. Vale took it. The screen filled with black where black should not be. Full belly, Vale said. Grace checked the pelvic binder. How many times did this slip? One medic near the door answered. Twice. Rotor wash made the lift bad. We reset once in the bird. Too low now. Tessa moved before being asked. On your count. Grace looked at Mercer's face. Fast and high. Not where it looks comfortable. Where it works. They shifted the binder. Mercer's body arched against the bed. Owen flinched. Grace did not. Pressure, she said. Owen checked. 70 over palp. Pulse 138. Blood. Running, Tessa said. Second unit. Spiking now. Vale packed deep and swore under his breath. Retroperitoneal loss. Possible vascular. Grace's hand moved to Mercer's left groin, then lower to the thigh. The leg was cooler than it should be. The body was pulling blood inward, surrendering territory. Femoral inflow is failing. Vale looked up. You can tell that through this mess. Grace held his gaze. Check it. He did. The pulse was fading. For the first time since the helicopters landed, Vale's face showed something that was not anger. It was recognition. Outside Bay 3, someone shouted from Bay 5. Respiratory, we need help here. Grace did not look away from Mercer. Who is in 5? Marcy answered from the doorway. Blast lung. Saturation falling. Grace pointed to the therapist. You split after the next chest check. Send back up here. Bay 5 needs mechanics before numbers. The therapist nodded and moved. Owen looked toward the sound worry pulling his attention. Grace caught it. Owen. He looked back. If you split your brain, you become useless in both rooms. He swallowed. Pressure 72. Pulse 136. Good, stay with him. The OR call had not come. The room knew it without anyone saying it. Vale knew it too. We need an operating room. Marcy spoke from the doorway. 12 is turning over. Maybe 10 minutes. Grace hated the number. 10 minutes was a story people told themselves when they did not want to say unknown. Mercer did not have a safe 10. She looked at the wound field, the fading leg, the blood, the binder, the monitor's ugly argument with the body. Then she looked at Tessa. Tubing clamps. Vascular shunts. Any size that might bridge field diameter. If it is labeled questionable, bring it. Tessa froze only long enough to understand that the request did not live inside normal procedure. Then she ran. Owen stared at Grace. You are building one here. Grace kept her hand on Mercer's leg. I am building time. Vale looked at her across the wound. This is not in any protocol I know. Grace's eyes stayed on the bleeding. No. A beat passed. Then Vale looked down at his hands. Tell me where. Grace did. And this time he listened. Listening was not surrender. It was the first useful thing the room had done since the helicopters touched down. Grace Callahan stood on Mercer's left side with one hand pressed near the cooling line of his thigh and the other hovering over the field Vale had opened. Blood welled up dark and fast, then disappeared under gauze. Then came back again, as if the body had become a broken pump no one could reach in time. Dr. Preston Vale's hands were inside the wound field. They were good hands. Grace had known that from the beginning, even when she disliked the man attached to them. Fast, exact, angry only until they touched the body. Once Vale was working, his pride had less room to breathe. Clamp lower, Grace said. Vale shifted. Here, lower. He moved again. There. He held. The room seemed to tighten around that single point. Tessa rushed back through the doorway with sterile packages stacked against her chest tubing, across one forearm, clamps gripped in her fingers. I brought everything labeled vascular. Everything that looked like it might be vascular. And one thing I'm pretty sure belongs to orthopedics but scared me enough to bring anyway. Grace glanced over the supplies once. Good. Tessa spread them across a clean towel on the side table. Her hands moved quickly, but her face had gone pale beneath the freckles. Grace noticed. Tessa. What? Breathe before you touch the sterile field. Tessa stopped, one breath in, one out. Better. Grace chose the least elegant option. A narrow shunt, flexible enough, long enough, not perfect, but perfection belonged to rooms with time, and prepared teams and patients who had not been crushed beneath a training structure before being bounced through the sky. Owen Clark read from the monitor. Pressure 68 over palp. Pulse 142. Oxygen 88. Say it again in 30, Grace said. His eyes flicked toward Mercer's face. Right. Major Daniel Cross stood at the foot of the bed, both hands locked around the rail until his knuckles went white. He had command in every line of his body, but Grace could see the cracks under it. Dust at his temples, blood on his sleeve that might not be his, a cut along his jaw that had stopped bleeding because his body had more important things to do. He was staying upright through discipline alone. Grace did not have room for his grief. Major, she said. Cross looked at her. If you stand there staring at him, you are furniture. His jaw tightened. What do you need? Status outside. Ibarra has the yellow tags. 2 are unstable but holding. 1 airway, concern 1 leg swelling hard. 5 walking wounded, contained near the south entrance. Security is trying to keep civilians from filming. Tell Ibarra to mark last pain response on every yellow tag. If they cannot speak, he marks that too. If the airway patient changes voice quality, he sends him through read, not through your panic. Cross nodded once. Yes, ma'am. Go. He hesitated. Grace looked at him. Mercer is not helped by being watched. The words hit him. He took one breath, then left the room. Vale did not look up. You talk to majors like that often. Grace fed the shunt through her fingers, checking its bend. Only when they're in the way. Tessa's mouth twitched despite herself. Mercer groaned. It was low and rough, a sound dragged out of a place below language. His body tried to pull inward, his shoulders tightening against the sheet. The medic at the rail leaned closer. "Chief, stay down." Mercer did not hear him. Grace bent near his ear. "Night watch. You are in San Antonio. Your men are outside. You do not get up. You do not reach. You do not fight the hands keeping you alive." His eyelids fluttered. For 1 second, his eyes cracked open. They were unfocused, pale with shock, but they found her voice before they found her face. His lips moved. No sound. Grace leaned closer. He tried again. 6. The medic beside the bed closed his eyes. Tessa looked down. Owen forgot the monitor for half a breath. Grace did not let the moment stay soft. Pressure. Owen jerked back to the screen. Pressure 66. Pulse 144. Blood. "Second unit running," Tessa said. "Third is primed. Hang it. On it." Vale's voice was tight. "If we do not restore flow, he loses the leg before he makes the elevator. If we do not control the loss, he loses the body before the leg matters," Grace said. "I know." "Then hold lower." Vale looked at her once. No anger now. Not gone forever, but gone from the work. He adjusted the clamp. Grace leaned in. The field was ugly. Tissue swollen. Blood obscuring what had to be seen. The damaged vessel sat half-hidden, torn enough to leak life into spaces no hand could compress for long. She remembered other fields. Sand under knees. Red light. Men calling grids with voices too calm to be safe. She pushed the memory down until only the useful part remained. Angle. Depth. Flow. No wasted motion. She guided the shunt into position. Vale held exposure. Tessa passed what Grace requested before Grace finished the words. Owen counted time under his breath, eyes locked on the monitor. At the edge of the room, Marcy Reed appeared with a radio in one hand and 2 fresh nurses behind her. Bay 5 is crashing harder. Blast lung, respiratory is there, but they need another set of hands. Grace kept working. Who is leading it? Dr. Patel. Can Patel handle chest? Yes. Then give him hands, not opinions. Keep Bay 5 from stealing this room's blood unless you want 2 dead instead of 1. Marcy absorbed that. Blood bank says we are burning through supply. Tell them the helicopters made that argument late. Marcy almost smiled, almost. Observation is delayed triage now. Your major sent me 2 medics. Use them. I am. Good. Marcy looked at Mercer, then at Grace's hands, then at Vale's face. Something in her shifted again. Not surprise anymore. A recalibration settling into the bones. She turned and left. The shunt seated. For 1 terrible second, nothing changed. Then the line below Grace's fingers warmed by a fraction. Not enough for hope. Enough for math. Vale checked the distal pulse. His eyes narrowed. Pulse returning. Owen read the monitor. Pressure 72 over palp. Pulse 138. Oxygen 89. Tessa let out a breath she had been holding. Grace secured the bridge. Do not celebrate a door that is only cracked open. Vale packed deeper. I need suction. Tessa passed it. Here. More gauze. Coming. Mercer's pressure climbed another few points, then sagged again. The body was not saved. It had only been convinced to stay in the conversation. Grace looked toward the doorway. OR. Marcy's voice came from outside. Room 12 is still turning. They are clearing neuro equipment. Tell them to stop admiring their equipment and make a hole. Already did. Tell them again with less kindness. Marcy shouted down the corridor. Grace turned back to the bed. Owen, when he moves, what are the words? Owen looked confused. What? When he moves upstairs, what are the words that keep him alive? He swallowed. Active temporary vascular bridge. Unstable pelvis. Ongoing massive transfusion. Chest decompression with persistent respiratory compromise. Again. He repeated it. Again. He repeated it cleaner. Grace nodded. If you say he's bad, they will hear drama. If you say those words, they will prepare. Vale glanced up. That is true. Owen looked at him, startled by the agreement. Grace did not react. From outside, the trauma floor thundered around them. Bay 5 called for chest tube supplies. Bay 6 needed pelvic stabilization. A civilian stroke alert was being moved out of observation because Marcy refused to let the military emergency erase the people who had arrived before it. Somewhere near the waiting room, a man shouted that his wife had been waiting 3 hours. Marcy's voice cut through the hall. So 3 hours means she is alive enough to be angry. That is the best news you have today. Sit down. The shouting stopped. In Bay 3, Grace reached for fresh gloves and changed them without stepping away from Mercer. Her right leg trembled once. Tiny, almost invisible. Vale saw it. So did Tessa. Grace shifted weight before either could speak. "Do not ask," she said. Tessa closed her mouth. Vale went back to work. The medic at the bedside, a young corporal with dust in his eyebrows, stared at Grace like she had stepped out of a story he had heard when he was still new enough to believe legends were built from whole truth. Grace looked at him. "Name." He blinked. "Corporal Hayes." "Hayes, your hand is drifting. Pressure is low pelvis, not his hip. Move 2 inches. He corrected. "Sorry, ma'am." "Do not be sorry. Be accurate." "Yes, ma'am." Mercer's body jerked again. The oxygen dipped. Respiratory leaned in from the doorway, face slick with sweat. "Bay 5 needs me back. This airway is holding, but not pretty." Grace watched Mercer's chest. The left side still lagged, but not worse than before. "Go to 5. Send Larkin here. Larkin is with PEDS. Then send whoever can report chest rise without worshipping the monitor." The therapist nodded and vanished. Vale muttered, "You have an opinion about everyone." "I have information about everyone. That sounds exhausting. It is useful." A fresh respiratory therapist entered 30 seconds later, older, steady-eyed. "Larkin is tied up. I'm Simon." Grace looked at him. "Tell me what his body is doing." Simon stepped in, assessed without touching first. Left chest lagging. Color gray, but not falling. Jaw tension increasing. He is working harder than the number says. Grace nodded once. "You can stay." Simon blinked. Tessa whispered, "That's high praise." "Take it." Another call came from the hall. "Reed Bay 6 needs binder reset." Marcy shouted back, "Use the medics, cross-sent. They want orders. Then give them mine." Grace heard the exchange and kept her eyes on Mercer. That was the change beginning under the blood and noise. Lone Star Regional had stopped acting like a collection of separate egos. It was becoming one organism. Civilian nurses, military medics, residents, surgeons, security, clerks, everyone pulled into one map. Not because Grace demanded worship, because she removed friction, because she placed people where they were useful and cut them away from where they were not, because she spoke only to the problem in front of her. Owen called out, "Pressure 76/40, pulse 134, oxygen 90. Vale's hand stilled for a fraction. "Say that again." Owen did. Vale looked at Grace. He might reach the room. Grace looked at Mercer's face. He might. No more than that. She had seen too many men die after might. Cross returned to the doorway with a folded casualty sheet in one hand. "Ibarra has names and mechanisms. Airway yellow is horse now. Not Strider yet." Grace took the sheet without reading it. "Send him to Bay 2 if Patel can spare respiratory. If not, keep him upright oxygen, no lying flat. If he stops answering questions, he moves." Understood. Compartment syndrome. Pain increasing. Foot still warm. Mark the time. Elevate nothing. Do not let someone make it pretty at the cost of perfusion. Cross nodded. His eyes moved to Mercer. Major Grace said. He looked at her. "Report, then move." He stepped back from the doorway. "Yes, ma'am." Vale watched him go. "He listens to you like you outrank him." Grace's hands moved over the dressing. "No. He listens because he has seen what happens when he does not." Vale said nothing. A noise rose outside Bay 3. Not one voice, but many alarmed and overlapping. A stretcher wheel squealed. Someone shouted for help near the south corridor. Marcy appeared again, moving faster than safe. Grace. That was the first time she used the name during the crisis. Not Callahan. Grace. What? One of the yellow tags seized outside. Military medic wants to bring him in. Mechanism. Head strike. Initially responsive, now posturing. Grace looked at Vale. Can you hold this for 30 seconds? Vale's answer came without hesitation. Yes. She looked at Owen. Do not follow me with your eyes. Follow his pressure. Owen nodded. Grace moved. The pain in her leg flared the moment she stepped into the hall. She let it burn and kept walking. The corridor outside Bay 3 was a living map of controlled failure. Bay 5 had blood on the floor and a chest tube going in. Bay 6 was full of hands around a pelvic binder. A civilian, elderly man in observation kept trying to stand while a nurse repeated his name. Security held a line near the waiting room where families craned their necks and phones glowed in trembling hands. Grace reached the south corridor as two military medics rolled in a young soldier whose body had gone stiff in the wrong way. His jaw was clenched. One arm pulled inward. His eyes stared past the lights. Marcy was beside the stretcher. 24. Blast exposure. Head impact? Was talking outside, then seized. Grace checked his pupils. Unequal, breathing present but unstable. Blood in one ear. Bay 2. Bay 2 has the airway yellow. Who is worse in the next 2 minutes? Marcy answered after half a second. He is. Then Bay 2. A medic asked, what about the airway? Grace looked at him. Can he speak? Yes. Then he can wait standing up with oxygen and a medic who knows what fear sounds like. The medic nodded. Grace turned to Marcy. CT. Backed up. Unback it. Marcy looked toward imaging. They'll scream. Let them. Marcy's mouth tightened into something almost like satisfaction. Done. The seizure patient rolled past. Grace stepped into Bay, too long enough to place hands-assigned tasks and cut panic into pieces. Oxygen. Suction ready. Protect the head. Do not chase the arm. Owen is not here, so someone else reads time. If he seizes again, I want duration, not guesses. A nurse at the wall said I have time. Good. The airway yellow waited just outside the door, upright on a litter 1 medic holding oxygen near his face. The soldier's voice had gone rough. Grace stopped in front of him. Say your full name. Sergeant Will Alvarez. Again. He repeated it. Hoarse but clear. Tell me where you are. Hospital, San Antonio. Tell me what hurts. My throat, chest, pride. Grace looked at the medic. If his answer gets shorter, he moves. If his voice gets softer, he moves. If you feel stupid, asking him the same questions, you are doing it right. Yes, ma'am. Grace returned to Bay 3. Her leg burned harder now. She could feel sweat under the back of her scrub top. Her hands were still steady, and that was what mattered. Inside Bay, 3 Vale had held the field. Owen looked terrified but present. Tessa had the 3rd unit running. Simon was at the airway, speaking in a low voice as he watched Mercer's chest. Grace stepped back into place. Pressure. Owen answered immediately. 74/42. Pulse 132. Oxygen 91. Bridge. Vale said holding. Pelvis. Tessa checked the binder. Holding. Chest. Simon said. Still working hard. Not worse. Good. Vale looked at her. CT just got cleared for the head injury. Grace nodded. Marcy is making enemies. She is good at that. She is better when she knows why. The OR phone rang outside. Marcy grabbed it. Everyone in Bay 3 heard her voice change. Say that again. A pause. Room 12 is open. Grace did not look up, but the room felt it. Marcy appeared in the doorway. Or 12. They are ready for him. Vale performed the inventory with his eyes. Abdomen packed. Temporary bridge active. Pelvis bound. Chest decompressed but unstable. Blood running. Airway ugly but holding. Pressure bad but present. There was no good moment to move a patient like Mercer. There was only a moment less likely to kill him than the others. Vale looked at Grace. As ready as he gets. Grace turned to Owen. You ride with him? Owen's face tightened. I do. Yes. Vale cannot talk to every person in that elevator. Tessa is on blood. Simon manages airway. You speak the words. Owen nodded. Active temporary vascular bridge. Unstable pelvis. Ongoing massive transfusion. Chest decompression with persistent respiratory compromise. Again. He repeated it. Not like a student. Like the room depends on you being understood. Owen straightened. Active temporary vascular bridge. Unstable pelvis. Ongoing massive transfusion. Chest decompression with persistent respiratory compromise. Grace held his eyes. Good. They prepared the move. This was where rooms often failed. Not in the dramatic procedure. Not in the visible crisis. In the transfer. In the lift. In the 3 feet between bed and stretcher where lines caught pressure, shifted blood lagged, and people who had been disciplined for 10 minutes suddenly rushed because movement felt like progress. Grace placed every hand. Tessa blood stays above the line. Simon Airway owns the head. Vale right side packing. Hayes pelvis. Owen monitor and words. Nobody moves because someone else moves. We count once. The OR stretcher locked beside the bed. The transporter looked too young. Grace saw his fear. Name. Evan. Evan, you do not steer until I say go. If someone shouts and it is not me, Vale, or Simon, you do not move. His throat bobbed. Yes, ma'am. Good. Mercer's eyes cracked open again. He was not truly awake. Shock made islands. Pain dragged the body through them. His gaze rolled, caught on the ceiling, then drifted toward Grace. His lips moved. Grace leaned close. No, she said softly. You do not ask about your men right now. His brow tightened. They are accounted for. That is all you get until you stay alive long enough to argue. A sound came from him. Almost a laugh. Almost blood. Then his eyes slid closed. Grace stood upright. On my count. The room locked. 1, 2, 3. They moved him. For 1 second it worked. Then the pressure dropped. Owen saw it first. Pressure falling. 60, 58. Tessa swore. Simon tightened at the head. The transporter's hands jerked toward the rail. Grace planted one hand over the packing and the other over the area protecting the bridge. Stop moving. Everyone froze. The room wanted to rush. Every instinct screamed, go faster. Get upstairs, run, move, escape the falling number. Grace's voice stayed low. Give the blood 5 seconds to catch up. Owen stared at the monitor. 1. The line trembled. 2. Tessa held the blood high. 3. Vale did not breathe. 4. Mercer's pulse flickered but remained. 5. Owen swallowed. 64, 68. Grace looked at the transporter. Now go. The stretcher rolled. Not fast. Clean. Vale took the right rail. Tessa walked with the blood. Simon controlled the head. Owen called pressure every few steps. Hayes held the pelvic line until the doorway, then released to the OR team, taking over in the hall. Cross appeared near the elevator but did not crowd. Grace saw him. Major. He stopped. Let them move. His hands curled once, then opened. He stepped aside. Vale glanced back at Grace as the elevator doors opened. For a second, there was something in his face he did not yet know how to say. Then the doors closed on Mercer, Vale, Owen, Tessa, Simon, and the blood that was keeping a man attached to the world. Grace stood in the corridor. The sound shifted. Without Mercer in Bay 3, the department rushed back in around her. All of it at once. Bay 5. Bay 6. The head injury on the way to CT. The airway yellow still upright and answering questions. The civilian stroke alert. The waiting room. The blood bank. The clerks. The medics outside under floodlights. The map had not ended. It had only changed shape. Marcy came beside her. You should sit. Grace looked at her. Tell me that when no one is bleeding. Marcy held her gaze for half a second, then handed her a fresh pair of gloves. Bay 6. Grace took them. Bay 6 held a soldier in his 30s with a pelvic crush and shrapnel through the upper thigh. His face was gray, but his eyes were awake and furious. Awake and furious was better than quiet in a man like that. A Navy medic held pressure at the thigh while a Lone Star nurse tried to secure a second line. The patient gritted his teeth. "I'm fine." Grace stepped in. "No one who says that in this room is fine." His eyes moved to her. "Who are you?" Someone with less time than patience. That earned a breath that might have become a laugh if pain had allowed it. Grace checked the binder, the wound, the distal pulse, the pressure trend. "This binder is too low. The medic said we set it outside." Outside was not wrong. It is wrong now. The medic's face tightened defensive. Grace looked at him. "I am not grading you. I am using the time we have." He nodded. Together, they reset it. The patient cursed so violently that the nurse at the line flinched. Grace leaned close. "That was good." The soldier stared at her. "What?" "Your pressure held through the pain. Keep swearing if it helps." He blinked. Then he cursed again with purpose. The line went in. Grace looked at the nurse. "Nice." The nurse's shoulders dropped half an inch. "Thanks. Do not thank me. Tape it before he earns another personality." In the hall, Marcy shouted for more blankets, more labels, more hands. Grace stepped out just as Cross returned from the south lot. Airway yellow is stable. Alvarez is still answering. Compartment patient is worse. Where? Outside, foot cooler. Grace pointed to a medic coming down the hall. "You. Bring him to monitored hall 3. Not bay unless pressure changes. Get Doppler if you can find one. If not, fingers and honesty." The medic nodded and ran. Cross watched her. "You are running a civilian floor like a field route." Grace took a clean dressing from a cart. "No, I'm running a civilian floor that got hit by a field problem." He looked toward the trauma rooms. "You always make it sound simple." "It is not simple." "I know." Grace glanced at him. His voice had shifted. The major was still there, but under it was Daniel Cross, a man counting the living because he already knew he would have to count the dead if the night turned. "Mercer went up alive," she said. Cross absorbed it like a blow he had asked for. "Thank you. Do not spend that yet." He nodded. Marcy called from the station. "Grace, CT wants to know if head injury can wait 3 minutes." Grace looked toward Bay 2. "Can he?" The nurse inside called back. He seized again. 40 seconds, airway intact. Grace answered Marcy. "Number." Marcy turned back to the phone. She said no. That is the full sentence. Grace moved to observation. The civilian stroke alert was being prepared for imaging. An elderly man kept trying to apologize for being in the way. His wife sat beside him with both hands wrapped around her purse knuckles, pale. Grace checked his face grip speech. His words came thick. "I'm sorry, soldiers need you." Grace crouched to eye level. "You are my patient too." His eyes filled with confusion and fear. "My mouth feels wrong." "I know." His wife whispered, "Is he going to die?" Grace looked at her. "I do not know. I know we are moving now." The honesty steadied the woman more than comfort would have. Grace stood. "Transport ready." A tech nodded. Then, "Move." The tech moved. For the next hour, time lost shape. Grace did not experience it as a line. She experienced it as rooms, pulses, pressure trends, voices, skin color, breath, sounds, and the location of every person likely to become useful in the next 60 seconds. She sent one military medic to hold pressure on a civilian wound because blood did not care what uniform surrounded it. She sent a resident out of a room because his fear had become extra noise. She put him back in 5 minutes later with a smaller task and watched him succeed. She had Tessa return from the OR pale and shaken, then gave her exactly 1 minute against the wall with water. Tessa tried to argue. Grace said, "You can take 60 seconds standing, or your body will take 5 minutes on the floor." Tessa drank the water. Owen returned from upstairs with blood on his shoes and a different face. "Mercer is in surgery," he said. Grace was checking a chart. "Did you say the words?" "Yes." "Did they hear you?" He nodded. "They heard me." "Good." His voice cracked slightly. "Vale backed me up." Grace looked at him then. Owen swallowed. "He told the OR team that if they ignored the bridge, they would kill him before opening." Grace returned to the chart. Then Vale was useful. Owen almost smiled. He was. A crash call erupted from Bay 5. Grace moved before the second shout. The blast lung casualty was fighting the ventilation's oxygen falling chest movement wrong. Dr. Patel worked at the bedside, sweat on his forehead, hands steady but overloaded. "I need another chest tube tray," Patel said. Grace looked at the patient's chest, the tube already in place, the color, the neck, the ventilations. "No. You need to stop forcing air into a space that is not accepting it." Patel looked up sharply. For a second, another ego stood at the edge of the room. Then he saw what she saw. "Disconnect and bag slow," he ordered. Simon, back from the OR run, adjusted. The oxygen dipped once, then climbed. Patel looked at Grace. "Thank you. Watch the body before the machine." He nodded. She left. By then, the hospital had stopped asking why a nurse was giving direction. The questions had become luxuries, and luxuries had been stripped from the floor. At 8:12, the south lot finally began to clear. The walking wounded had been processed. The yellow tags had either entered the department or stabilized outside. The worst military casualties were in imaging surgery or monitored bays. Civilian patients were still angry, still afraid, still waiting, but no longer invisible. Marcy stood at the board hair slipping from its knot marker ink smeared across the side of her hand. She looked at the room as if seeing damage after a storm. Grace came beside her. "Count." Marcy read without being asked. 12 red, 7 yellow, 5 walking wounded, 3 in surgery, 2 in CT, 4 monitored, 1 transferred to university. No deaths on the floor. Her voice caught on the last sentence. She covered it with anger. "That is a terrible metric." Grace looked at the board. "It is the one we have." Marcy laughed, once dry and exhausted. "I hate that you're right." Grace shifted weight off her bad leg. Marcy saw it. This time she did not look away quickly enough. Grace caught her. Marcy's face tightened. "I kept you at the desk." "Yes, I thought I was managing risk." "You were. That is not absolution." "No." Marcy looked back at the board. For a moment, neither woman spoke. Then the OR phone rang. Marcy grabbed it. "Read." She listened. Her eyes moved to Grace. "Mercer is still alive. They are working vascular now. Vale is asking for the major." Grace closed her eyes for less than a second, then opened them. "Tell Cross." Marcy held the receiver out. "You tell him." Grace stared at the phone. The floor noise softened around her, not because it was gone, but because fatigue had lowered every voice by a degree. She took the receiver. "Major." Cross answered immediately. "Here. Mercer is alive in surgery. Vascular is working. That is all we know." Silence. Then Cross exhaled. It was a sound too small for the weight behind it. "Understood." Grace almost hung up. Cross spoke again. "Grace." She waited. "I found Ibarra. He said to tell you the map held." The words moved through her differently than she expected. Not praise. Not memory exactly. A bridge between the person she had been and the person this hospital had finally seen. Grace looked through the glass toward the south lot, where rotor dust still drifted under the floodlights. "Tell Ibarra to update his casualty times before he gets sentimental." Cross gave one quiet breath that might have been a laugh. "Yes, ma'am." Grace hung up. Tessa came out of Bay 6 and leaned against the wall. "I think my bones are vibrating." Owen stood beside her. "I think I forgot my first name." Marcy capped the marker. "Both of you chart before your brains turn into soup." Tessa looked at Grace. "What about her?" Marcy followed Tessa's eyes. Grace was already moving toward Bay 3 with a trash bag in one hand and clean linen in the other. Tessa stared. "She is cleaning the room." Marcy watched Grace strip bloodied sheets from the bed, where Mercer had nearly died and where the room had learned to listen. "No," Marcy said quietly. "She is resetting it." Grace worked alone for almost 30 seconds before Owen joined her. He did not ask permission. He took the trash bag from her left hand and held it open. Tessa arrived with disinfectant wipes. A military medic brought fresh suction tubing. Marcy came last carrying a new chest tube tray. No one made it ceremonial. That would have ruined it. They cleaned the room because another patient would need it. Grace wiped the side table where the improvised shunt supplies had been laid out. The towel was gone. The blood was not. It clung in small lines near the table lip. She cleaned until the surface reflected the overhead light again. Owen worked beside her in silence. After a while, he said, "I thought I knew what calm looked like." Grace folded the dirty linen into the bin. "You knew what quiet looked like." He nodded slowly. "That is different." "Yes." Tessa sprayed the rail and wiped it down. "Do you ever get tired of people being wrong about you?" Grace looked at the clean bed. "Yes." Tessa waited. Grace did not add more. In the hall, another monitor alarm sounded. All four of them looked up. Marcy's voice returned to its old edge, but something underneath had changed. "Callahan." Grace turned. "Bay 5 needs eyes." Grace tossed the last wipe into the trash. On my way, her limp carried her back into the hall, steady and visible beneath the fluorescent lights. This time no one watched it first. The hallway outside Bay 5 smelled of blood plastic iodine and rotor dust. Grace Callahan stood under the fluorescent lights with fresh gloves on her hands and dried blood at the edge of her sleeve. The sound of the Blackhawks had faded from the walls, but not from the people inside them. Everyone still moved as if the floor might shake again. Nurses turned their heads too quickly at every distant engine. Patients looked toward the doors whenever the glass trembled. Even the monitors seemed louder than usual, their tones cutting through the department in thin silver lines. The storm had passed, but the building had not yet believed it. Bay 5 was stable enough to survive the next hour. Bay 6 was waiting for vascular. The head injury from the south lot had gone to CT and come back with bad news, but not hopeless news. The civilian stroke alert was already on the way to intervention. The older woman with the hidden chest injury was breathing easier through a mask, her daughter asleep upright in a chair beside her, with one hand still wrapped around the rail. No one had died on the floor. That did not make the night clean. It only meant the damage had moved into rooms with brighter lights and longer odds. Grace stepped into the supply room and reached for a box of gauze. Her right hand stopped halfway to the shelf. For the first time in hours, there was no immediate voice calling her name, no pressure crashing in front of her, no hand reaching for the wrong medication, no major standing in a doorway with war in his eyes, no surgeon arguing with time. The quiet came too suddenly. It opened a small space inside her, and into that space came pain. Her right leg locked from hip to knee. The old injury flared with a deep electric pull that climbed into her lower back and tightened her jaw before she could hide it. She put one hand against the shelf, not for long, only long enough to keep the body honest. One breath, then another. A box shifted behind her. Grace turned. Owen Clark stood in the doorway, holding a roll of tape he clearly did not need. His eyes dropped to her hand on the shelf, then rose fast. "I was looking for tape," he said. Grace looked at the roll in his hand. "You found it." He looked down at it, as if surprised. "Right." For a moment, neither moved. Owen had blood on the front of his scrub top and a thin red line across his wrist where a glove had failed. His face had changed since the afternoon. The eager brightness was still there, but it had been struck by something heavy enough to leave shape behind. "Dr. Vale is still upstairs," he said. "Mercer is in surgery. They got vascular in." Grace took the gauze from the shelf. "Alive." "Yes?" That single word settled into the room with more weight than it should have carried. Grace nodded once. Owen shifted. I said the words. She looked at him. "At the OR doors." I said them exactly. Active temporary vascular bridge. Unstable pelvis. Ongoing massive transfusion. Chest decompression with persistent respiratory compromise. His throat worked. They stopped moving like it was a normal trauma. They heard me. Grace placed the gauze into his hands. "Then you were useful." Owen let out a breath that almost broke into a laugh. I have never been so grateful for such a small compliment. It was not small. He looked at her, then really looked as if the sentence had done something to him. "I froze earlier," he said. "With the interstate driver, with the needle, with Vale." "Yes." He winced. Grace moved past him toward the hall. Freezing is information. Staying frozen is the problem. Owen followed her out. Do you ever get tired of turning everything into information? Grace looked toward the trauma bays. Yes. She kept walking. The department had entered that strange hour after disaster, when bodies kept working because stopping would make them understand too much. Tessa sat at the nurse's station with a cup of water in both hands. She had not taken a sip. Marcy stood at the board marker in hand, staring at names and room numbers as if they might rearrange themselves into forgiveness. A clerk cried silently while printing transfer papers. A military medic slept sitting up against the wall near the south entrance, chin against his chest, hands still stained red. Security had finally pushed the last cluster of filming bystanders away from the glass. Outside, floodlights still washed the parking lot in a pale, exhausted glow. Grace set the gauze on a cart and checked Bay 5 again. The blast lung patient lay sedated, chest rising in a shallow but steady rhythm. Dr. Patel stood at the foot of the bed, arms crossed, eyes on the patient instead of the screen. Grace noticed. Patel did not look away. I am watching the body, he said. Good. He glanced at her. That was annoying advice. Yes. It worked. Yes. He gave a short nod. She left him there. At the central station, Marcy capped and uncapped the marker 3 times before speaking. Callahan. Grace stopped. Marcy's voice had its usual edge, but the edge was worn thin. Count with me. Grace stepped beside her. The board was dense with names, initials, room numbers, arrows, transfer notes, surgical holds, military tags, civilian identifiers, and times written over times. Marcy read quietly. 12 red military casualties, 7 yellow, 5 walking wounded, 3 emergency surgeries still active, 2 in imaging follow-up, 1 transferred to university, civilian stroke and intervention, interstate driver in surgery, no deaths on the floor. The last line came softer than the rest. Grace looked at the board. No deaths on the floor, she repeated. Marcy laughed once, but there was no humor in it. That is a terrible thing to call victory. Grace did not answer. Marcy glanced at her. You look like hell. So does the floor. The floor did not decompress a chest in the hallway. Grace looked at her. Marcy held up one hand. I know, not now. The phone rang before either of them could decide whether the moment had become a conversation. Marcy grabbed it. Emergency read. She listened. Her eyes moved to Grace. Grace knew before Marcy spoke. The room around her did not stop, but it narrowed. Marcy covered the receiver. Mercer made it through vascular repair. Still critical. They are moving to abdominal control. Vale says he is alive because the bridge held. Grace looked at the counter. There was a smear of old coffee near the keyboard. Someone had left a roll of tape stuck to a lab slip. A single blue glove lay inside an empty emesis basin. Ordinary things. That helped. Tell him to keep his hands useful, Grace said. Marcy stared at her for half a second, then spoke into the phone. She says, keep your hands useful. A pause. Marcy's eyebrows lifted slightly. He says he is trying. Grace turned away before anyone could read her face. Tessa watched her go. Grace entered Bay 3. The room had been cleaned, but not completely. Rooms remembered. The floor shone where blood had been scrubbed from tile. The bed was remade with fresh linen. The monitor cables hung coiled and ready. The chest tube tray had been replaced on the side table. The ultrasound screen was dark. Grace stood beside the bed where Mercer had nearly left the world. For a moment, the room was empty enough to hold the past. Another bed. Another light. Canvas instead of hospital sheets. Dust instead of polished tile. Men calling out casualty numbers. A radio dying in someone's hand. A sniper named Nightwatch refusing to be loaded before the younger man beside him. Grace closed her eyes. Only briefly. When she opened them, Dr. Preston Vale stood in the doorway. He had changed scrubs. His hair was damp at the temples. His face looked older than it had that afternoon. Blood had been scrubbed from his hands, but the skin around his nails was still raw from the brush. He did not enter at first. That was new? Mercer is still alive, he said. Grace kept her hand on the bed rail. Marcy told me. Vascular got flow. Temporary bridge held long enough. It was not temporary once it mattered. Vale absorbed that. No. He stepped into the room slowly. I was wrong. Grace looked at him. Vale's jaw flexed. He seemed almost angry at the shape of the words, but he did not take them back. I told myself it was clinical caution. Staffing judgment. Risk management. I told myself I was protecting the floor from an unknown quantity. Grace waited. Vale's eyes moved to her leg, then away, with visible shame. But it was simpler than that. I saw the limp. I saw the quiet. I saw someone who did not perform competence in a language I recognized. The monitor in the empty room remained dark. Vale looked at the bed where Mercer had been. I put you at the edge because I thought the center was safer without you. Grace's voice was even. It was not. Number. He swallowed. I need to say it clearly. I was wrong. And I made the department wrong with me. That landed differently. Grace released the bed rail. You were not the only one. I know. He met her eyes. But I had the loudest voice. Grace studied him for a moment. Vale looked like a man standing without armor and hating the feeling. Finally, she said, next time be useful sooner. The corner of his mouth moved not quite a smile. That is fair. It was not meant to be fair. He nodded. Still, a call came from the hall. Vale turned by instinct, then stopped and looked back at her. Callahan. Yes. In the OR, when Owen gave report, he did not shake. Grace said nothing. I thought you should know. She nodded once. Vale left. Grace stayed in Bay 3 a moment longer. Then she reset the oxygen tubing because it was half an inch out of place. When she returned to the station, Marcy had placed a cup of coffee beside the keyboard. Black. No sugar. Grace looked at it. I did not ask for coffee. Marcy did not look up from the board. You do that a lot. Grace picked up the cup. It was hot enough to sting her palm. Marcy spoke more quietly. I kept you in overflow. Yes. I told myself it was because you were good with families. Good with difficult rooms. Good at keeping the edges from catching fire. Grace took one sip. The coffee was bad. It was also exactly what she needed. Marcy continued. I did not ask whether I was keeping you there because the edge was useful or because I could not imagine you in the center. Grace set the cup down. What answer did you find? Marcy looked at her then. Both women were too tired for pretty lies. The second one. Grace let the silence hold. Marcy looked back at the board. Tomorrow you are not on overflow. Tomorrow the board may need overflow. Then someone else can learn to be useful there. Grace almost smiled. Almost. Marcy uncapped the marker and wrote Grace's name beside trauma coordination for the next day shift, though the next day shift had not started and the night had not yet ended. The letters were plain. Callahan. No flourish. No apology written in ink. Still, Grace saw it. She lifted the coffee again. Your handwriting gets worse under stress. Marcy looked at the board. That is not stress. That is character. Tessa, seated 2 chairs away, finally drank her water and made a sound that might have been a laugh. The south corridor doors opened. Major Daniel Cross entered with Staff Sergeant Ibarra beside him. Both men looked carved down by the night. Cross had lost the sharp command shape he had carried through the first hour. Not entirely. It would return when needed. But now his shoulders sat lower. The mission had moved from immediate survival into accounting, and accounting always had teeth. He stopped near Grace. Mercer is alive, he said. Yes, his team is accounted for. Grace watched his face. All of them. All of them. It should have been relief. It was more complicated than that. Cross glanced at Marcy. Your floor held. Marcy pointed the marker at Grace without looking up. Her map held. Grace said the floor held because people worked. Cross nodded. Ibarra said the same thing. Ibarra stepped forward. He was shorter than Cross, with dust still in the lines around his eyes, and a bandage wrapped around one forearm. Ma'am. Grace looked at him. You ran the yellow tags. "Yes, ma'am. Your times were clean." His face changed as if the compliment had struck somewhere deep. "Learned that from old stories." Grace's expression did not move. Stories are usually edited by people who were scared. Ibarra looked at her watch. "Not those." Cross cleared his throat. "There are people who will want to speak with you." Grace picked up a stack of charts. "They can make an appointment. I mean command." "I know what you mean." Cross looked toward the trauma rooms. "You disappeared after Kandahar. I transferred. That is a word for paperwork." Grace's eyes stayed on the charts. "Paperwork is where people put things they do not want to carry by hand." Cross did not answer immediately. Tessa looked down, pretending not to listen. Marcy openly listened because Marcy had lost interest in pretending. Cross lowered his voice. Harbor 6 was not only a job. Grace's hand tightened on the edge of the chart stack. The movement was tiny. Cross saw it anyway. "You were the person people trusted when every official channel broke." Grace looked at him then. "Channels break, and you draw new ones." She held his gaze long enough for the past to press between them. Then she handed him a clipboard. "Sign your transfer acknowledgments before you get poetic." Ibarra looked away quickly. Cross almost smiled. "Yes, ma'am." He signed. The night thinned toward morning. The sky outside the ambulance bay shifted from black to deep blue, then to the color of watered steel. San Antonio began to wake beyond the hospital walls. Trucks moved on distant roads. A sanitation crew arrived near the far lot, stopped at the site of the military floodlights, and waited. The first day, shift nurses entered through the side doors and slowed when they saw the board. No one had to explain everything. The floor wore the story. Tape on the walls. Empty blood coolers. Staff moving too carefully. Military medics asleep in chairs. A trauma surgeon speaking softly to a resident. Marcy Reed, standing with marker ink on her hand and no patience left for foolishness. Grace finished charting at 6:42. She checked the last casualty packet twice. She restocked Bay 3 again, even though Owen had already done it. She replaced 2 missing syringes in the airway drawer. She wiped a spot of dried blood from the lower rail of a stretcher in the hall. Tessa came beside her. "You know, there are people whose actual job is cleaning." Grace dropped the wipe into the trash. "There are also people whose job is checking." Tessa leaned against the wall. "Are you coming back tomorrow?" Grace looked at her. "I am scheduled." "That is not what I asked." Grace's face softened by a degree. "Yes." Tessa nodded, satisfied by the only answer she needed. At 6:55, Owen approached with a folded note in his hand. "OR update." Grace took it. "Mercer critical. Alive. Ongoing abdominal management. Vascular repair intact. Further surgery likely." She read it once. Then again. Owen watched her. "He called for you before they sedated him deeper." Grace did not look up. "He was not fully conscious." "I know." "What did he say?" Owen hesitated. "He said tell 6 the line held." Grace folded the paper slowly. No one spoke. The department noise continued around them, softer now, as if even the machines had learned to give one breath of space. Grace placed the update into Mercer's packet. "Chart it." Owen blinked. "Chart it." He said it. You heard it. Owen nodded. "I'll chart it." At 7, the shift officially changed. Nothing in emergency medicine truly changed at shift change. Pain did not respect the clock. Blood did not pause for handoff. But people pretended there was a line because without lines the days would swallow each other whole. Marcy stood at the board with the incoming charge nurse. Grace walked toward the exit with her duffel over one shoulder. Her limp had deepened now that the work no longer forced it into the background. Each step cost more than the one before it. She kept them even anyway. Near Bay, 3 Vale stood speaking with Owen. He saw Grace and stopped. Owen stopped too. Neither man moved into her path. That was the difference. Not applause, not speeches, not sudden reverence. Space. They gave her space because they finally understood that space was not pity. It was respect. Marcy called from the station. "Callahan." Grace turned. Marcy lifted the coffee cup Grace had abandoned half full on the counter. "You forgot this." Grace looked at it. "That coffee was terrible." Marcy nodded. "Yes, keep it." Marcy watched her for a long second. Then she raised the cup in a small, tired salute. Grace turned back toward the doors. Major Cross stood near the ambulance bay phone to his ear, speaking quietly to someone who needed numbers and names. He saw her passing and lowered the phone. "Grace." She paused. Cross did not call her Harbor 6. That mattered. "Mercer has a long road," he said. Grace nodded. "He has walked worse." Cross looked at the morning light beyond the glass. "So have you." Grace adjusted the strap on her shoulder. "Roads are roads." Cross accepted the answer because he knew it was the only one she would give in public. "Take care of the leg." Grace looked at him. "Take care of your people." "I am trying." "Try cleaner." He smiled, then small and exhausted. "Yes, ma'am." Grace stepped through the automatic doors. Morning heat had already begun to rise from the pavement. The south lot still bore the marks of the night. Tire tracks in dust. Dark stains near the floodlight stands. A strip of medical tape stuck to the curb. Beyond the hospital, San Antonio moved into another ordinary day, unaware of how close the night had come to breaking the people inside those walls. Grace stood for a moment under the pale sky. No helicopters. No alarms. Only distant traffic, a bird calling from the edge of the lot, and the low hum of the hospital behind her. Her leg hurt. Her hands were tired. Her watch was scratched and smeared at the edge with something that might have been blood or old dust. She looked once toward the north where the military roads ran beyond the city. Then she turned away. Inside Lone Star Regional, a new ambulance backed toward the bay. The doors opened. A paramedic called for help. Marcy's voice rose through the glass, sharp and alive. "Trauma team, move." Grace had already taken one step toward the parking lot. She stopped, closed her eyes for a single breath, then turned back toward the doors. Not fast, not dramatic, steady. The automatic doors opened for her, and this time no one inside looked first at the limp.